Hi, I just finished grading all of your discussion question assignments for week 2 FAA enforcement, and I wanted to provide you with some feedback and a couple other notes too. As you're reading through the textbook, you're probably noticing that our textbook author is very anti-FAA and believes that the FAA is always out to trap you, and that in many cases your best defense is to say nothing, not ever admit that you're the pilot of the aircraft or that you flew recently or that day. And sometimes that is a great defense. But what I want you to keep in mind is that you are in a professional aviation program, and most of you are planning to be airline pilots or corporate pilots. And in that kind of flying, you are going to be on an instrument flight plan, which means you will have filed all of your information with the FAA, and they will have no trouble proving that it was in fact you that were flying that aircraft at that time. So sometimes being a little cagey with the FAA in that situation may come across as just rude or that you're just really not cooperative, which is not an attitude that you ever want to convey to the FAA. So just keep that in mind and think about how your responses to question 1 might change if you knew that the FAA could prove that it was you that was flying the aircraft. On question 5, where we talk about the aviation safety reporting system with the NASA forms, I want to clarify a couple things for you. You should always file a NASA form if you believe that there may have been any type of violation. Filing the form is not going to hurt you unless you file a form after you've been involved in an aircraft accident, after you've committed a crime involving an aircraft, or after you've made a deliberate violation of the regulations. So, for example, if you look through FAA case law and different NASA forms online, you will see that some poor idiot every year files a NASA form after they transported illegal drugs across the border. Okay, that's not going to help you there, and that will cause NASA to turn that file over to the FAA. For deliberate violations, you will always see some poor pilot that did a low pass over his girlfriend's house or his church and then filed a NASA form. That was a deliberate violation, and it will get turned over to the FAA, so don't do that. Once you file a NASA form, though, you will have immunity, assuming you haven't filed it for one of those 3 items. And the FAA still has the option to pursue a case against you, and if the case goes in the FAA's favor, then whatever sanction they are going for, let's say it's suspension of your certificate for 60 days, that suspension will appear on your file, but you will not have to serve the 60-day suspension because you filed a NASA form. So it will still be on your record, which is a problem if you are a professional pilot, but you won't have to serve the suspension. That's the takeaway that you should be looking at for this. You all did a really nice job on question 6, talking about the notice of proposed certificate action and the purpose of informal conferences. I wanted to touch base with you on question 7, where we talk about orders of suspension and your rights of appeal. The FAA has the burden of proving the violation, but they only have to prove it by a preponderance of evidence, which means that they have more evidence that you did the violation than you present about not doing the violation. So basically it comes down to, does the judge think it's more likely that the violation occurred or that it didn't occur? The beyond a reasonable doubt only applies in criminal situations. And then finally, I want to talk about the supplemental discussion question we had, talking about 14 CFR 6127, voluntary surrender of certificates, which probably left a lot of you scratching your head on why would you ever voluntarily turn in your certificates. back in the day, probably 30 or so years ago now, many FAA inspectors prescribed to this informal policy called a desk drawer suspension. So let's say an inspector was out on the weekend at an airport, just watching, going to do ramp checks. They see someone enter a traffic pattern incorrectly, so not as published. The inspector might have gone over to the pilot after the pilot landed and said, look, I know you did the wrong kind of base. That was not what was published, and I'm not too pleased about it, so you're going to give me your certificate. I'm going to put it in my desk for a week. I don't want to see you flying during that week, and at the end of the week, you can come back, you can get your certificate, no one else will know about it. That was a desk drawer suspension, and it drove headquarters in DC crazy because they felt like they didn't have a lot of control over the enforcement process. So they implemented 61.27, which now says that unless you submit a signed statement turning in your documents, you haven't surrendered them. So you don't need to be concerned that an FAA inspector, when he asks to see your documents, is going to walk off with them. If he does, and he won't, but if he does, you have not surrendered your certificates. Because you have not followed 6127. So don't play tug of war with an inspector that's doing a ramp check. Hand over your certificate. They can hold them, let them make photocopies of it. All of this goes to showing that you have a compliant attitude, and if there happens to be a violation, the FAA is going to look at that compliant attitude and be more likely to either not enforce or to reduce the sanctions that they're asking for. So that finishes up week 2. You're well underway in week 3. I look forward to reading all of your case summaries, and if you have questions, please drop me an email or reach out by phone. Thanks.